European Compass podcast, the podcast where we explore the heart of Europe through its food, its markets, and the stories behind every dish. I'm your host, Julia Doust, and if you've ever planned a trip around a meal, then you're in the right place. Let's dig in. So today we are talking about Burgundy and specifically what I drank in Burgundy. So if you listen to last week's or the last episode, then that was about the food that I ate in Burgundy. Today we're going to be talking about what I drank, and obviously that's going to focus on wine. This is Burgundy after all. So I'm going to start with just a little reminder. I am not a wine expert. I am not a trained sommelier. I do not know all the intricate details in and outs of these wines. However, I am an amateur of wine in the French sense of the word. That means that I enjoy wine. It's one of my hobbies. I drink wine on a regular basis. It's something that I do spend my money on, and it's something that I do seek out when I travel. So that's the basis that we're coming from here. We're not coming from a basis of, I know everything about wine and I'm going to teach you. We're coming from the basis of, what is Burgundy actually like to visit for someone who likes wine but isn't an expert? Because I think that's most people. I think there is a certain type of person that knows all the intricate details of what makes one wine different to another and all the details about which estate and which vineyard does what. That's not where I'm coming from. What I'm coming from is, what is Burgundy like as a wine lover, as someone who enjoys to drink, quite happy to find out a bit more about what's there, but without going into any sort of technical detail. So that's where we are. So Burgundy is on the eastern side of France, which is the opposite side of France to where I live. I live on the west coast. It runs down from above Dijon down to just above Lyon. And the wine part of that concentrates around Beaune. So it concentrates on the round south of Dijon going down through Beaune, except for Chablis. Now Chablis sits above Dijon. It sits in its own little island, not an island, a real island, but in terms of if you look on a map of Burgundy wines, you'll see a sort of eye shape. So you'll have the main strip. It really is quite a corridor of the wine producing regions in Burgundy. And then you'll have the dot as though it's the dot of the eye, and that's Chablis. I didn't go to Chablis on this trip, so we're not really going to be talking about Chablis, but just to know that it is part of Burgundy, but it is a little bit apart. So if you're visiting Beaune, for example, you think, oh, I'll just pop to Chablis for the day. You can do it, but it's not right next door. So it does involve a bit of a drive. I think it's probably a 2, maybe even more hours drive from Beaune. So it's not as close as all the other vineyards that are in the area. I started my trip actually in Avallon, which is to the northern part, a little bit closer to Chablis, but we didn't go to Chablis. But Avallon is near another wine producing area called Vézelay. Now Vézelay, it's not that well known. It's not a big producing area. I'm not even sure if their wine gets exported particularly. So you might not have heard of it. I didn't really know it as a specific wine. We had some Vézelay wine. It was the first wine I had in the area because we were staying at the Hotel La Poste in Avallon. And the owner there has his own vineyards in Vézelay. And Vézelay, I would describe it as being like a Chablis. It's a Chardonnay, as is most of the wine. Most of the white wine in this area is Chardonnay. We'll get onto that later. And it's very nice. It's possibly not as sophisticated as a Chablis, but it's certainly very pleasant and very easy drinking. I didn't get to taste any other Vézelay, so I really can't say whether this was a particularly good example. And I have to confess, I didn't note the year because we were in a cocktail bar and I was busy interviewing someone, so I didn't get to check the year on this one. But it was a starting point for what was to come. And then we went to Beaune. Now, Beaune as a town is very wine focused. Wine is why Beaune exists. Everything there focuses around the wine and the wine industry. It's just the whole town. It's not a big town. It's a nice town, I would say, charming without being extraordinary. But if you're a wine lover, this is the place to be. And what you'll find in Beaune is that every menu, every restaurant menu in terms of the wine menu comes in a great big book. This is not just a list of sort of 5 reds and 5 whites that you can get. This is an entire book of different wines that they've got in stock. And we went to several restaurants and they were all the same. They were all, I'm sure they stocked different types of wine, different vineyards, but they all had this great big book. And what we came to learn in Beaune is that they are very passionate about their wine, obviously, but also very particular about the different vineyards that it came from and the different conditions that the wine was grown in. And it is actually a little bit intimidating because it gets to the stage where you're like, I just quite like a nice drink. And you can't act like that in Burgundy. So that's the first thing to know from my point of view, is it's okay to admit that you don't know and you would like help. They're quite happy to help and quite happy to describe. But what they will do is describe in great detail about which particular parcel this particular wine came from and which year and what made it good. So we started, and I recommend anyone who goes to Beaune does this. We started by going on a wine tasting. And there's lots of wine tastings available. There's lots of companies that offer them. And we chose to go to Patriarche Fils. A Patriarche Fils are a wine négociant. That means that they don't make wine. They buy wine in and then they age the wine and then they bottle the wine. But they don't grow the wine themselves. And Patriarche Fils is one of the old established négociants in Beaune. And one of their particularities is the extent of their underground cellars. So a wine cellar in France is a cave. Spelt cave, it's a cave. And their cave go underground and they have 5 kilometres of underground cellars. 5 kilometres full of wine. Some of this wine's still in barrels, some of this wine is bottled, some of it is being aged, some of it's being stored because the value goes up as you store it. And you can go and visit. It's about 25, I think it was 25 euros for the visit, and that includes the tasting. So it's a what they call a visite libre, which just means that you're not guided as you're walking through. So you go down, you walk through these corridors in the cellar, and you don't walk all 5 kilometres. You walk. The walk is about 500 metres, I think, and you get to see some of the barrels, some of the way the bottles are kept. You get some of the environment in terms of the temperatures and things. That the advantage of keeping wine in these cellars is that the temperature and the humidity, both are important, is stable. So it's stable year round, whether it's winter or summer, whether it's really hot outside or whether it's freezing cold outside, the cellar temperature stays pretty even. And that's why the wine is stored there. And so we went down and we walked along, and then about 3/4 of the way along, you get to taste the wines with a sommelier. So they had, and it wasn't just one sommelier they had there. There was 3 or 4 there dealing with different groups. So there's small groups. You're getting some individual attention, and they made us taste. Well, originally it's supposed to be 5 wines, 2 whites and 3 reds. And we ended up with an extra red because we were talking to the sommelier and he wanted to explain a particular point to us. So the first thing that they explain is about the grape variety, which is called cépage in French. And in Burgundy, the main grape varieties are Chardonnay for the white and Pinot Noir for the red. Now, there is a small amount of the white Aligoté grown as well, and we'll talk about that later. And there is some Gamay grown. The Gamay gets mixed into some of the lower classes of wine. It is not allowed in the Appellation Contrôlée for the main wines in Burgundy. So your Côte de Beaune, your Côte de Nuit, they don't allow Gamay. It is 100% Pinot Noir. And that's something that the sommeliers explain. And the other thing they explain is a little bit about the way the land lies and how it affects the grapes, and the way the climate affects the grapes, and how one year can be very different from a next. What we found was they were really, really good. They've obviously got their spiel. They've got this standard spiel that they do to all the customers. They did speak, we were speaking French to them, but they did speak English. There were American clients in there at the same time as us, and they were speaking good English. So that's not a concern. What we found is they have this standard spiel about this is the wine and this is what you're going to taste and this is what you should be tasting. But if you question them and actually say, okay, so why is this wine different from this? What exactly makes this wine different? What different factors come into play? What do you think is the best year? If you start really engaging them in conversation, then you get a lot more out of this. And we realised this, that we were getting quite a lot more talk from our sommelier than some of the other groups, because we were quite passionate about the subject and discussing it. And we were also discussing the differences between the Burgundy wines and the Bordeaux wines. And so we got quite a lot out of this visit. And I think this is a really good place to start when you first get to Beaune, is to do, there's lots of wine tasting, and you'll get lots of wine tastings. You can go and book wine tastings in with the individual growers, and they will explain to you their different ways of doing it. The advantage of going to a négociant first is that they're not fixed into one particular wine from one particular grower. And therefore they can explain a little bit more about what the differences might be. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is to go to the tourist office. So the tourist office in Beaune have a little exhibition in the back room. It's free. And it's really, really well done. And it explains all the differences between the geography. So there's a big map in the middle that shows you the different villages and different towns along the Côte d'Or, which is this strip of land where the slopes come down, and that's where the wine is grown. And there's also discussion about the different history behind the wine in the area. And then they go into detail about how the climate can change the wines and how the grapes are grown and the different parts of the winemaking process. It's not a big exhibition like the one I went to in Porto, which was a massive big museum about all the different types of wine, but it's a really, really good place to start in Burgundy, because it's so specific to Burgundy that they're talking about Burgundy in particular. And they talk about something called climat. So they have now, as part of UNESCO have recognised French wine as being a cultural heritage, and particularly the climat de Bourgogne. So by climat, they don't just mean climate. So by climat, they are talking about the terroir. They're talking about the different types of soil that make up the wine. They're talking about the different expositions, so whether or not that particular parcel gets sun or wind or frost. And they are talking about the climate affects it as well, but they're also talking about the knowledge of the wine growers and how that can affect the wine. So all of these things come together and make what they call the climat. So when you see signs saying Climat de Bourgogne, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the climate. They're talking about all these different individual factors that go into making Burgundy wine and to give Burgundy wine the character that it's got. Now, I must say that Chardonnay in general is not my wine of choice. I find Chardonnays tend towards the sort of honey, soft flavours, and I like white wine that's crisp, and I like citrus and apple flavours in my white wine, and the Chardonnays tend towards the more stone fruit. They tend towards a honey sort of flavour. But the particularity about Chardonnay, and Chardonnay when it's grown in Burgundy, is that it's not simply Chardonnay. That you can't say, I like Chardonnay or I don't like Chardonnay, or Chardonnay tastes like this. Because I think one of the reasons why Burgundy has become what it is in terms of its importance around wine is that wine here can taste very, very different from one vineyard to the next, even when there's only a few metres between them. If you take the same variety, so the same cepage, this is Chardonnay, it's all Chardonnay, and you take it from one vineyard where it's lower down and it gets the sun all day long, and you take it just a little bit higher up where the soil changes a little bit and there's a little bit more granite around, then you're going to get a different flavour to the wine. And actually the difference is quite startling, and that's one of the things these wine tastings can give you, is that usually if we order a bottle of wine, we drink a bottle of wine, we don't taste different wines next to each other. And what was really, really good about this trip was being able to taste different wines next to each other and being able to spot these differences. And you really can spot when someone says to you, oh, look, this wine was made in a year that was particularly sunny, or this wine was made in a year when there was more rainfall, or this particular wine grows higher up, and you can taste the difference. I've no doubt that the sommeliers that are trained on this can tell the little tiny differences between each different parcel. I'm not at that stage yet, but I could tell the differences. And that was really, really nice to know. So we've got the Chardonnay for the white wine, and then we've got the Pinot Noir for the red wine. Now, the thing about Pinot Noir is that it isn't your big, powerful wines. This is not... So Bordeaux tends towards the big, powerful, fruity wines with bold textures. Burgundy isn't really like that. Burgundy is softer. It's more elegant. It's more complex, but it is lighter. These are a lighter type of wine. And to some extent, I would maybe describe them more as a lunchtime wine rather than an evening wine. Now, a lot of people are going to disagree with me there. I have no doubt about that. But for me, I like a more powerful red in an evening. I like something with a bit of oomph. And that was one of the things when we were talking to sommeliers and we were asking them which wine would they recommend. That's one of the things that I make a point of saying. Because if you are someone that prefers a little bit more oomph in your wine, a little bit more power, then you do need to tell the sommeliers that in Burgundy, because a lot of the Burgundy wine is much lighter. So from talking to the sommeliers, one of the things we realised, so I was with my daughter on this trip, one of the things we realised was that she prefers the lighter, fruitier wine, and I prefer the deeper, more powerful wines. And so we learned that I should be looking for wines that were harvested in a year that was difficult for the growers. So wines that were harvested in a year where there were droughts, where there was a lot of really high temperatures, maybe in a year where the vines were under stress because there'd been a late frost, or things like this. Whereas if you're looking for a lighter wine, then you should go for wines that were harvested in a year where there was more rainfall progressively throughout the summer. The summer particularly, they said that the summer is where the important differences between the grapes happens. So whilst in the spring, the important thing is whether or not there's late frost, which can kill the leaves just as they're coming out of their bud. That's when they're delicate. Once they're out, about 3 weeks after they're out, they're no longer at risk to frost. And to be honest, by then the frosts have gone anyway. But if the leaves come out before the last frost, then there's a problem, because then the leaves can get killed by the frost and then that's it for the year. So that's one of the things that the area is particularly sensitive of. And one of the problems they're having with climate change, for example, is that climate change is bringing warmer temperatures earlier in the year, but it's not necessarily making the last frosts earlier. So you're getting a warmer spell, which brings the leaves on, and then the frost comes and kills them. So it's one of the things that they're having to fight over. It's the case across France anyway, and other areas, you see Italy and Portugal have this less because they're further south. They get less of the problem with the frost. Burgundy it's one of the northernmost places where you can grow red wine. And this is why they're fighting against the frost and the climate. And apparently it's one of the reasons why Burgundy makes good wine, is because they have to fight to make it. And by fighting, they're putting the vines under stress, and a stressed vine makes a better grape. So the first place we went to after we'd gone to this wine tasting was the L'Oiseau des Vignes, which I talked about last week. It's where I had my Earth on Mourette last week. And they are peculiar in that they have this very big wine list, like everybody else, big book of wine list. But they also have 32 wines that you can have by the glass. At most restaurants in Burgundy and in France in general, you can get wines by the glass. And there's usually 2 or 3 different wines that you can have. But that's it. That's the choice that you've got. This particular restaurant has 32 different wines that are open for serving by the glass. And they've got a special method of keeping them once they're open to make sure that they don't spoil. And so we talked to the waitress. It wasn't a sommelier, it was a waitress. But all the waitresses here, they all know about wine, because that's what this is the wine area. So everybody's there for wine. So they all know about wine. And we said to her, okay, we've been told that I need a wine that's from a difficult year with a bit more character, and my daughter wants a wine that's more fresh and fruity. And straight away she said, okay, yes, you want this one and you want that one. So they gave us the right wine. Mine was a 2021 from Louis Saint-Georges. Nice. Not the best wine I had in Burgundy, but it was very nice. In terms of saying the best wine I had in Burgundy, part of my problem is that, as I said, these wines are a little bit light for me. So any wine I have here, whilst it's going to be the best wine I have in the area, it's not necessarily going to be my favourite wine. I had wine that was more to my taste when I was in Portugal. I even had wine that was more to my taste when I was in Hungary, because I prefer something with more flavour. And that's going to upset a lot of people who say that Burgundy wine is the best wine in the world. How can you say that? Well, I can say it because, as our sommelier said, wine is a matter of taste. Everybody's got different tastes about which wine they like and which wine they don't like. So there's no shame. I have no shame whatsoever in saying that for me, Burgundy wine is not the best wine in the world. I've no doubt that it has more complexity. I've no doubt that there's lots more to learn about it. And I'm certainly very happy to drink Burgundy wine, but it will never be my favourite. But this wine was very good, and I will certainly go back to L'Oiseau des Vignes, and I would certainly listen to their suggestion. So the other places that we went for when we ended up looking, so we've talked about Chardonnay being the main grape. Because I prefer the sharper, crisper wines, I actually prefer Bourgogne Aligoté, which is, Aligoté is the type of grape, it's a cépage, but it's sold unusually for French wines, because French wines normally don't have the name of the grape variety on the label. It's not necessarily that you're supposed to know, it's because the French don't think that is what's important. What's important is the terroir, it's important is where it's grown and what conditions it's been grown in. So you don't go out and buy a bottle of Chardonnay, you go out and buy a Chablis. But unusually, the Bourgogne Aligoté is sold with Aligoté on the label. Now, I think that's probably because so much of Burgundy wine is the Chardonnay, and because the Appellation Contrôlées mean you have to have Chardonnay to have a Côte de Beaune, a white Côte de Beaune, it has to be Chardonnay, that there is a different system of controls for the Aligoté wines. And so in order to make it absolutely clear, they're labelled as Aligoté. Now, Aligoté wine is treated a little bit like the poor man's wine. I remember I was talking on an internet forum about wine, about the fact that I was going to Burgundy and that I'd chosen to go to Burgundy for the red wine. And someone sarcastically said, "Oh, who's going to tell her that they make white wine there too?" And I replied, "Oh, don't worry, I know. Bourgogne Aligoté is one of my favourite wines." And the sniff that you get, because, oh my goodness, no, you're going to the place where the best Chardonnays in the world are, and you can't talk about Aligoté as though it's some sort of poor cousin. No, you have to go to the rich wines. Or, I don't particularly like the rich wines, I much prefer the Aligoté. The Aligoté is a crisp wine, it's clean, it's got apple and citrus, and it a little bit like a Sauvignon, but almost even more so. It's really crisp and lovely. I really, really like it. But it is treated as being, oh, we'll kind of plant it as extra. And in general, in the area, it's grown to serve as Blanc Cassis or Kir. Now, we talked about that in the last episode as well. We talked about how the priest Kir, or Canon Kir, who was a resistance fighter in the Second World War, became Mayor of Dijon, and then the Blanc Cassis was named after him. So the white wine that they use for Blanc Cassis is Aligoté. And that's pretty much what it's used for in the area. Everybody else drinks Chardonnay, except if you're having Kir. But I found some growers that were changing this. This is starting to change, and people are starting to realise that this is a popular wine and people do want it, and that there are subtleties to Aligoté wine. And I think one of the reasons for that is that Chardonnay, and particularly the Burgundy Chardonnays, benefit from ageing. They benefit from being laid down and ageing a little bit more. And the Aligoté wines can be drunk fresher. They can be drunk younger. They're more an aperitif wine, and they fit into the more modern, younger vibe that people are going for these days. And so the wine growers have realised this, and they are starting to experiment more with Aligotés. So we looked for a vineyard that specialised in Aligotés. And we ended up at a place called the Clos du Moulin au Moin, which means the clos is, so CLOS, means a walled vineyard. It's a vineyard that has a stone wall around it. And the Moulin au Moin means the mill of the monks. So this was an old monastery where they used to make wine. The monks used to make wine, and we went there and specifically requested a tasting. We hadn't booked, which we should have done. So if you want to visit the vineyards to do some tastings, book ahead. So either on their website or give them a call. They will speak some English if they're used to having people in for doing tastings. But book it in advance, because quite often they're working in the field. So the same people that give you the tastings are also working in the field. So if they're busy in the fields, they're not going to be there to help you with the tasting. And that's something important to remember as well. If you go at a time of year that's particularly busy, like harvest time, then it's going to be more difficult to get tastings. So think about that when you're thinking about your timing to go. Actually, the summer's quite a good time because they're not so busy. In the spring, when we were there, they were busy in the fields. Quite a lot of places were very busy in the fields, and we did see a lot of workers in the fields. But we got lucky here. Lovely people, talked about the wine, explained why we were there, And he apologised and said he didn't actually have any Aligoté for me to taste. And said, okay, well, if you like that, will you allow me to try and persuade you towards a Chardonnay? I'm like, I'm always open for persuasion. So he got out some of his Chardonnay and then he showed me a map. And this is a perfect example as to how serious the whole wine business is taken here. Is that they don't just want you to know, oh, this wine's good or this wine's bad. They want you to know exactly where this wine came from. Not in terms of the town, not in terms of the part of the town, but from exactly which part of which field this wine came from. So he gets out this map and shows us this photograph of this particular parcel of wine. The parcels here, this is important to notice. So when I'm talking about a parcel, I mean the part of land that particular grower, that particular estate owns. And Burgundy's a little different to Bordeaux in that in Bordeaux you will have chateaux and they will own all the land around. They have these big estates with lots of vineyards that are all theirs. Burgundy doesn't quite work like that. So because of various Napoleonic rules on inheritance and because of the way that the Burgundy wine plots were split up, people often own just one bit of a vineyard. They might own one parcel, one part of a field, or they'll own a small vineyard, but the next small vineyard is owned by someone else. And some of these wine growers will own little plots like this, little parcels like this, in various different towns even. And so they will grow and they will make 3 or 4 different wines, and they will be from these specific parcels. So he said to me, okay, if you like a crisp wine rather than the normal sort of honey, golden Chardonnays, then try the Chardonnay that came from this particular field. And he showed the photographs of the field, of the vineyard. And he said, okay, this is where we have our Aligoté. These vines here on this side, these 3 rows are Aligoté. That's where all our Aligoté comes from. And then these 3 rows here are Chardonnay. So they're grown in the same vineyard. It's a clos, so it's a walled vineyard. They grow in the same conditions as the Aligoté. And because of that, this particular Chardonnay has some of those aspects that I like in an Aligoté. So they have the I can't even say it. So they have the crispness, and they have the sort of apple and citrusy flavour. And the honey's still there, but it's not evident in quite the same way. It's not overpowering the crispness of this white wine. And I have to say, the nicest Chardonnay I've ever tasted. So I came home with a few bottles. Absolutely lovely. He got me to taste a couple of other Chardonnays, so exactly the same grower, but from a different plot, and those I didn't like. In fact, I didn't even finish. I swilled and I didn't drink them, which is very rare. And then he went on, and we hadn't gone for red. We weren't buying red. That's not what we were there for. But he said, well, while you're here, would you like to try some of the reds? So obviously we did try some of the reds. And their reds tend towards the more fruity, light red that my daughter likes. So she bought some of the red. And this was a really good example as what the growers, what you can expect when you go into the growers and go in to talk to them. A lot of the wine tasting, there's a price against them. So the one we did at the Patriarche Feast, the négociants, where we went for the cellar walk, was €25, including the 5 wines. And that's a little bit on the pricey side, but did include the tour of the cellar. We saw other tastings priced around about the €15 mark. Some were 10, some were 15. But when you go in, if you end up buying wine, generally they don't charge you. So because we went in there, I didn't actually see a price against the wine, the tasting in this place. And because I think he did say how many are you looking for, but we weren't buying boxes and boxes of it. I bought 3 bottles and my daughter bought 3 bottles. We weren't big buyers. But he was very open to, okay, try this. Oh, well, maybe you'll like this instead. Really, really generous, lovely guy, and a really nice place, actually. The place is really sweet. You go in through an archway. There's a little stream down, which I think must have come from like a water mill. There's a sort of stream to one side, and there was a lot of table and chairs out. So we said to him, well, why are the tables and chairs all out here? And he said, oh, we have a pop-up restaurant in the summer. So you can go there, and they don't do the cooking. I think they get a food truck or something in to do the cooking. And then you get to drink their wines as part of the meal. And that means you get to taste the wines, but while eating as well, which I think is a great idea. And honestly, it was a beautiful setting. And I think at night time with some fairy lights out, I think it would be absolutely gorgeous. So if you're in the area, the Clos du Moulin au Moin is worth looking out. I'll put a link below so that you can find it. But it would definitely be worth checking that out for their restaurant. So where was the best wine that I ate in Burgundy? We went on our last night, we went to the Bistrot de Beaune. It's a little bistro in town, do a Burgundy speciality menu, which again I talked about last week. And another one of these big wine lists with lots and lots of wine. So I had a quick look at it. And these wines, they start at, I'm trying to remember what the cheapest wine I saw, but probably around about the 30, 40 euro mark. But then they go on and on and on. And I don't know what the limit was. I don't know what the most expensive wine was. But they certainly have wines for 1,000 plus on these wine lists. So obviously asking the sommelier, which wine would you recommend, is a little bit risky in terms of budget. But I was totally open with him and I said, okay, I want something with a bit of power. I want something with some real flavour about it. And I don't want to go over about 60 euros. And he went, I know exactly the wine for you. Went away, came back, opened it, and he was right. So this was a red wine from Marcenais. So it was a grower called Jean Fournier. And he makes a Cuvée Saint-Urbain. And this was a 2021, I think, wine. He was right. Ask the waiters, and he was right. And this was absolutely it. In terms of a Burgundy, it was the one with the most power that we'd had. It was fruity. It was more towards fruit-wise, going more towards the sort of cherry and blackcurrant fruit rather than the sort of raspberry end, which I think is the lighter end. This is heading in towards cherry territory and blackcurrant territory. It was delicious. I'm not sure that on a regular basis I would pay 60 euros from it. I think they cost about 30. This particular bottle costs about 30 euros to buy. To put that into context for those of you who aren't in France, I can buy a very good Côte de Rhône or similar for 5 to 7 euros. A reasonable Bordeaux of a similar quality to this Burgundy might cost 10, perhaps 15 euros. So this really is, the Burgundy wines are much more expensive than other wines in France. And I wonder how much of this reputation around it being the best wine is linked into it being the most expensive wine. And there's lots of reasons behind why it's the most expensive wine. I'm not going to get into that here. But just know that if you really like wine and only have a limited budget, then Burgundy isn't necessarily the place to be looking. So I did look up the tasting notes for this particular wine, and one of the things that caught my eye was that its serving suggestion was that you should drink this wine with a roast chicken shared amongst friends, which I think is one of the nicest things you could say about wine. Drink it amongst friends. So that was Wine in Burgundy. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did enjoy it, share it with a fellow food traveller, and don't forget to subscribe for more delicious adventures. Until next time, bon appétit and happy travels.